Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. My aim is that this podcast will be useful for socialists, especially those of us in so-called Canada and people relatively new to socialist politics. I started to think about a podcast because my ability to write had been further limited late in 2020 by not going to physiotherapy, which I depend on to manage my musculoskeletal problems. That's because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But a podcast also provides opportunities for discussing ideas with people and for dialogue. I support an eco-socialism from below, a revolutionary democratic working class eco-socialism that tries to integrate and be changed by struggles against all forms of oppression, and that aims to bring all that's relevant in this tradition into future struggles in the hope of contributing to the development of a politics of human emancipation adequate for the times. Because I don't know of any existing podcast in this part of the world that's aligned with these politics, I've decided to try launching one. I hope to make this about one episode per month, perhaps occasionally more. I want to say a big thank you to the producer of Victor's Children, Jonathan Croker, without whom it wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Lega, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. The name of this podcast refers to Victor Serge, and in this episode, you'll hear my interview with Suzi Weissman about Serge. Some of the topics I'm planning for future episodes are class struggle today and tomorrow, Stalinism and the future of socialism, does dialectics matter, socialists and union staff jobs, and the history of the Communist Party of Canada. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a message through my website, prairiered.ca. If you find it interesting, please do tell other people about it, especially because the podcast won't have its own social industry accounts, and because I'm only on Facebook, not also on Twitter and Instagram. Without further ado, here's my interview with Suzi Weissman. I am very happy to have on the first episode of the podcast here, joining us from California, Suzi Weissman, who knows more about Victor Serge than just about anyone and is the author of a fine political biography of Victor Serge. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'd just like to start out by asking you to tell listeners who Victor Serge was.
It's a really good question because Victor Serge was one of those figures from the 20th century who was kind of lost in the maelstrom, and yet he participated in all of the tumultuous struggles of that century, and he wrote about them beautifully. So he's somebody that, I set out to rescue because he had been marginalized. And I guess before I tell you who he is, I should say why he was marginalized. And that was because he was an intransigent revolutionary. He would not compromise either with capitalism or Stalinism, which, defined the world after 1945. And so neither side wanted to claim him, and everybody was critical of him. And so he kind of sank from view, except among those who were, let's call them aficionados, that loved his novels, loved his memoirs, and wanted to, make sure that he was better known. So he was born in 1890. He is actually Russian, but he was born in exile. His parents were revolutionary populist anarchists, and his uncle had participated in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. So the family was on the run. His uncle was literally a rocket scientist who was executed for that. I mean, as he was dying, he was jotting notes on his ideas about rocket science. And so Victor Serge grew up in Brussels, in Belgium, in exile. His parents had nothing but contempt for what they called education, the bourgeois education for the poor. So he didn't go to school. He just went to libraries and art museums and read voraciously. And he was always poor. His parents, were not great at earning money. And nor was he. That was never a goal. Private enrichment was no fit goal for life, he used to say. But to participate in the making of history, that was the goal. And he became an anarchist early on in Belgium. He was already fed up with the stodgy socialism of the Social Democrats, who he thought liked to pass resolutions, but nothing more. And the anarchists, on the other hand, tried to put their beliefs into action and live life as if it was the society that they were trying to achieve. And then he, I'm probably going into too much detail, but he then joined a group of kind of anarchist bandits, the Bonnot Gang. They robbed from the rich and financed their organization, but they ended up, most of them in prison and executed. And Serge himself was accused of being the ringleader of the group, even though he denounced violence. He happened to write their, most of the articles in their press. So he spent 4 horrible years in prison, many of them in solitude in France. And out of that, he wrote his first novel, Men in Prison, which is really dark and hard to read, I find. But I met later people from the Spanish Civil War and other prisons and said that book spoke to them while they were there. Amazing that they had it. But then, so Serge in jail, and this is at the time of the First World War, was let out, and I shouldn't go through all the details, but he went to Spain, and he was he converted from being an individualist anarchist to an anarcho-syndicalist who believed that working class struggle was it, but distrusted power and distrusted parties and the state. And an anarchist uprising failed there, and at the same time, the Russian Revolution was beginning. In the Soviet Union, the land, there was his never seen homeland. The language that was his first language was Russian. So he tried to make his way back, and he ended up in Paris and was picked up as having been expelled after his prison sentence. He was put into a concentration camp where he formed a little Bolshevik group. They weren't sure who the Bolsheviks were, but they knew that they were Bolsheviks nonetheless. And they discussed Marxism. And then at the end of World War I, the French government was trying to negotiate to get captured members of the French Legion back into France, and they arranged a prisoner exchange. And Serge found himself, in this prisoner exchange, and plopped into Russia. But it wasn't the glorious days of the revolution; it was the beginning of the cold days afterwards. It was January; it was freezing. The Civil War was about to begin in 1918, and he spent the next until 1936 in the Soviet Union. And there he was incredibly active. He joined the Bolsheviks, but he criticized their departures from democracy and the ideals of the revolution while defending them against the counter-revolution. He ended up taking his stand with Trotsky and the left opposition. I don't want to go through the whole history, but he became an ardent left oppositionist. And he always said that the left opposition was not Trotskyist. We didn't believe in the cult of any leader. And it had as many, currents of thought as people. And they argued all the time, but they did have some, basic principles about commitment to Marxism and to international revolution, to the idea that the Soviet Union was but the first, but it was an international process, and that it couldn't be anything but democratic. Democracy was at the heart of the socialist project and inseparable from it. Anything that pretended to be socialism and was undemocratic just couldn't be socialist. Well, as you can imagine, he fell afoul of the party as Stalin began to assume control. And he, along with the left opposition, was expelled at the end of 27, and then found himself arrested several times and exiled in what he called internal deportation. And then, miraculously, because he was able to write his books, and he wrote in French and managed to get them published in France, the case of Victor Serge being in the Gulag was an embarrassment to the French Communist Party, because they were trying to recruit people And everybody was saying, especially the Trotskyists in France and others, they had a campaign to free Victor Serge. So it's a long story, but Romain Rolland and others told Stalin, you better let him go. Because it's hampering all of our efforts. And Stalin in 1936 really didn't know much about Victor Serge, but he looked at the interrogation record and decided that Serge did not represent much of a danger and had him expelled. And of course, that was Stalin's, I guess, second mistake. First, he expelled Trotsky, and now here's Victor Serge, this oppositionist, left oppositionist, who could speak most of the languages of Europe, who wrote brilliantly, and now he could join Trotsky in exile and continue the struggle against Stalin and the usurpation of the revolution. And then, this begins this period where he lives in France, and then, of course, the Nazis come to power, and he is on the run and ends up finally in Mexico, just like Trotsky, but a year later. He arrived after Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin. And Serge was certainly on a hit list, but he was not killed. He, or at least so far as we know, he was not killed. There's some rumors that he could have been poisoned, but what we think happened is that he had a heart attack in 1947. And what I've missed along the way are the kinds of things that he wrote and what he believed in, but that's just kind of a bare outline of his life.
Great, thank you. I think there are lots of ways in which Victor Serge matters to us today, and I just wanted to read you a quotation from an essay by Richard Grieman, in which he argues that Serge challenges us to think for ourselves and teaches us that revolution is an organic process in which we're both actors and acted upon, and in which all self-delusion is ultimately fatal. And he goes on to talk about the idea of double duty, the idea that Serge had about having a double responsibility to the revolution, to defend it from the outside against its reactionary enemies, and to defend it from within through courageous criticism of its errors and distortions, which Grieman calls a duty which demanded lucidity and loyalty in equal measure. Serge, at one point, writes about this idea of double duty, risking giving weapons to reaction and discouraging the indecisive, but saying that it would be worse to inadvertently stuff our heads with rubbish and create a revolutionary conformity that's as conventional and dishonest as any other. What do you think about some of those ideas in socialists today?
I think it's really important. The one word that always comes to mind is lucidity, because Serge said we have to see clearly and we have to speak truthfully. He had lived through the darkest days of Stalin's obfuscation of the truth, trampling of the truth, wiping out any critical thought. And so for Serge, in fact, if you look, he wrote a beautiful testament in his memoirs where he defended above all human dignity, right of inquiry, allegiance to the truth, and at the same time, relentless criticism against those who would betray it. And he also talked about the use of language, the way that language itself was subverted by Stalin and the Stalinists, and that it was the task of Marxists to wage that intransigent battle. And it is for truth and human freedom and respect for the enemy even. And, as I said in the beginning, utter socialist democracy. And that is encapsulated quite perfectly, I think, by the concept of double duty. That you are with the revolution, but you never fail to criticize it when it departs from its ideals. That at the same time, you analyze, what those departures mean. He understood the dilemma that the Soviet Union was in, that Lenin, I think, said quite well, that it is a terrible honor, that is a terrible misfortune that the honor of beginning the world's first socialist revolution should befall on backward Russia, because, of course, he meant Russia did not have the conditions to come to socialism, but it did have the conditions to have a revolution. And the only way that revolution could survive is if it was extended internationally. And Serge practiced that. He took part in 3 revolutions, lived in 7 countries, spent 10 years in prison in various forms of captivity. And as I mentioned in the beginning, he was born in one exile and he died in another, and he was an unrepentant revolutionary all of those years. But at the same time, he was also a participant and a witness. And so he wrote, and he wrote beautifully, and he wrote not just histories. I call him the historian, the bard, and the conscience of the left opposition. But he also wrote these incredible novels, so that when he was unable to convey some of the ideas, the ways that they were transmitted among people and the confusions, he turned to different literary forms. I think I've hit on most of what you said, but let me know if I haven't.
That's great. And maybe that's a nice bridge to the question about if someone today who doesn't know anything about history that Serge lived through or doesn't know anything about Serge would like to dip into some of the things that he's written. What do you think would be the best place to start? I mean, I have my favorites, but what do you think?
What is your favorite?
Well, I think Memoirs of a Revolutionary is just such an extraordinary book that it's the thing I always point people to if they're interested, or even if they've never heard of him.
I agree with you. That's what I was going to say. And it is the book, because it's so much more than just the memoirs. It's so typical of Serge that it's the memoirs of his life, but it's the memoirs of the revolutionary movement in Europe and in the Soviet Union. And then also later on at the end, not as much in Mexico because he finished it in 41 and he lived to 47, but almost everything is there, and it's written so incredibly so that new people, will find all these incredible vignettes, little sketches of the characters of all these revolutions and of the opposite movement too, and get a sense. And I always say that people, by reading Victor Serge, not only come to admire, let's say, his life and the ideas that he puts forward, but they get a feel for the times in a way that even watching a documentary or reading, another sort of drier history won't. And so I really recommend that. And then, and I have to say too that whenever I tell people I work on Victor Serge, I ask them what they've read or what they like the most. And it breaks down by country or by region. In Latin America, it was, of course, what was translated first, which was Whatever Revolutionary Should Know about, I think it's called about oppression. And that was when Serge, had uncovered the Tsarist files and talked about the way the enemy persecutes revolutionaries. But others say the memoirs. And of course, there's always those who like the novels best. And then it gets down to which novel do you like best. But I agree with you. I think a very good place to start is Memoirs of a Revolutionary. And for all the reasons that I just said, but also because I think today, this is Serge's moment. And I really applaud you for having this podcast, because Serge, was always with the rank and file. He didn't aspire to leadership. He didn't aspire to power. He abhorred it. He never succumbed to nationalism. He detested it. He was, his life was of an intransigent revolutionary internationalist, committed to democracy, which he found Soviet democracy was an incredible expression of. And today, when you think about the movements that grew up, especially after the Arab Spring and through Occupy, and then through, 2007 and 8, and then Black Lives Matter and everything else, Victor Serge, is someone that could speak to all of them, because he opposed statist, authoritarian, bureaucratic solutions. He called for revolutionary democratic forms, but he would make no truck with capitalism. And I think that is also the case for most of the young people today. They recognize that much.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. And if someone wanted to read one of his novels, which one would you suggest starting with?
Most people would say The Case of Comrade Tulayev, which is his sort of dialectical novel of the purges. You get a real understanding of it. I think, and I just reread Midnight in the Century, which it's wonderful.
It's actually my favorite novel.
It is mine too. But it does speak to who we are, David, and to the terrible story of the opposition in prison, essentially, and in exile. But so much comes through it. And then, the one that most people, and Richard Grieman is one of them, thinks is his worst novel, I absolutely love, which came out as The Long Dusk, published in Canada in English before anywhere else, and then went out of print, and New York Review of Books is going to bring it out, I think, in April, and it's got a new title, which I think is Last Times. I'm not sure, what I think about the title, but it's the story of the resistance, the generation in Europe at that time who are resisting not just Stalin, but also Hitler. And so I think it's got incredible lines within it. And a lot of, the revolutionaries recognizing where they went wrong, but still trying to find their way. So I think that's pertinent as well. But I agree with, of the novels, what do you like?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Midnight in the Century is the one that stands out for me. Yeah. I mean, I haven't read it for years, but I just think there's something, there's the lyricism of that novel and the way that the politics are conveyed. I have memories of it leaving a very big impression on me.
There's also another point about that, because most people know about Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. But I think this is the counterpoint to that in a way. Midnight in the Century, because Koestler, only came to the left during the Stalin era and knew nothing of those who were opposed to Stalin from the left. And so he ends up, being one of the God that failed group that, once Stalinism became communism, and that meant they rejected Marxism. But Serge gives us a much better view, a much, fuller view, and highlights the struggle of those who wanted to fight for the ideas that made the revolution worthwhile.
Yeah, and I think both through the memoirs and through the novels, we can have a sense of glimpses of the worlds that we've lost, in a sense, of the different lefts that Serge was part of, right, which were really largely destroyed by fascism and Stalinism, and the incredible people that were products of those contexts. And so, of course, while we can't and shouldn't try to recreate those, that nonetheless to have some appreciation of that legacy and all that's best in that inheritance, as we're trying to confront very different challenges in the 21st century. So I want to thank you very much for coming on this first episode of the podcast to talk about Victor Serge, and perhaps we'll be able to return to talk about a focused theme or two in a future episode.
Thank you. Can I just add one last thought? Serge remained an optimist, a historical optimist, even living through the darkest times, because he knew that the ideas he was struggling for could not be repressed, and in one way or another would, emerge and erupt from time to time. And it's worth holding on to that thought, I think. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Suzi. I hope you found the first episode of Victor's Children worth the listen. Please pass the word about it, and I hope you'll listen again.